My dad billed me $152,400 for my childhood. He didn't expect my response. They say you never really know your family until there's money on the table. I learned that lesson on January 12th, 2025, sitting in a law office that smelled like old paper and broken promises. My grandfather died 3 weeks before that meeting. 87 years old. Sharp as a tack until the very end, or so I thought. He'd been in a coma for 9 days before his heart finally gave out. I sat by his hospital bed every single one of those days, holding his hand, talking to him about nothing and everything. My father showed up twice. My mother once. My younger brother Kyle didn't come at all. Said he had midterms. The lawyer's office was one of those old-school places with dark wood paneling that probably cost more than my annual salary. Real oak. The kind that makes you feel small just by existing near it. Everything in that room screamed money and tradition. The chairs were leather, worn smooth by decades of people sitting in them while their lives got carved up by legal language. There was a grandfather clock in the corner, ticking away like a metronome, counting down to something terrible. I got there early. That's what you do when you're the responsible one, right? Show up on time, follow the rules, respect the process. My father always taught me that. Funny how those lessons work out. Arthur Brennan walked in at exactly 10 a.m. Not 9:59, not 10:01. Exactly on time because that's who he is. My father has always been a man of precision. His suit was pressed so sharp you could cut yourself on the creases. Hugo Boss, probably, or maybe Brooks Brothers. He wore his success like armor. The smell hit me before he did. That new car scent mixed with expensive cologne. He just bought a Lexus RX 3 months ago, silver with all the bells and whistles. Financed it. He casually mentioned at Thanksgiving, but the payments wouldn't be a problem much longer. He'd said it with this knowing smile, like he had some inside information the rest of us weren't privy to. Now I understood what he'd meant. My mother followed behind him, her eyes glued to her iPhone. She didn't look up when she entered, didn't acknowledge me sitting there, just found a chair and kept scrolling, her perfectly manicured nails tapping on the screen. Kyle showed up 15 minutes late, wearing a Columbia University hoodie that probably cost $200. He had his AirPods in and barely nodded in my direction before sprawling into a chair like he owned the place. At 22, my little brother had mastered the art of looking perpetually bored with everything that didn't directly benefit him. The lawyer, some guy named Morrison with gray hair and reading glasses on a chain, cleared his throat and opened a folder. He looked uncomfortable, which should have been my first warning sign. Lawyers don't get uncomfortable unless something's about to go sideways. He started with the standard stuff. Assets, liabilities, the legal framework of estate distribution. My grandfather had been smart with money, careful, owned his house outright, had some savings, a few investments. Nothing spectacular, but solid. The American dream in its most practical form. A lifetime of work translated into security. Then Morrison got to the house, the place where I'd spent every summer as a kid, learning to fish and fix engines and understand why silence can be more valuable than conversation. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, sitting on half an acre in a decent neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but real, solid, worth something. Morrison said the house had been sold. Just like that. Past tense. Already done. The closing had happened 4 days ago. While we were at the funeral, actually, while I was standing at the graveside watching them lower my grandfather into the ground, my father was in a title company office signing paperwork. Arthur had listed the property a month before Grandpa died, put it on the market while the old man was still breathing, still technically the owner, used that power of attorney to authorize the sale, found a cash buyer willing to move fast, closed escrow the same day we buried him. Sold for $450,000. I felt my stomach drop. The house was supposed to go to me. Grandpa had told me that a dozen times over the years. Not in a formal way, just in passing. The way old men tell you things when they're thinking about mortality, but don't want to make it weird. He'd said, I understood what that house meant. Understood the value of building something that lasts. My father cleared his throat. That particular sound he makes when he's about to explain why he's right and you're wrong. He told me he'd used the power of attorney. Said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. Grandpa had signed it years ago. Standard estate planning stuff. But Arthur had activated the week before Grandpa died, while he was in a coma, unconscious, unable to speak or object or do anything but lie there breathing through a tube. The lawyer had tried to advise against it. Arthur mentioned casually, suggested waiting, seeing if the old man pulled through. But the market was hot, Arthur explained, and there was a buyer ready to move. These opportunities don't wait for sentiment. Arthur muttered something else then, almost to himself. Said Grandpa had gone senile at the end anyway, kept obsessing over paperwork for that stupid radio tower, renewing licenses that nobody cared about anymore, updating registrations for equipment that hadn't worked in decades, waste of time and money. The money was already gone, transferred into a trust fund for Kyle, for college, Arthur said, for his future. Ivy League schools don't pay for themselves. He reminded me, as if I didn't know. As if I had to work 3 jobs to put myself through state school while Kyle got a free ride because he could throw a football reasonably well. I sat there trying to process it, trying to understand how you could take a dying man's signature, his legal authority, and use it to erase his actual wishes. But apparently, that's just how it works. Power of attorney means power. Period. The intent doesn't matter once the paperwork is signed. Morrison looked at me with something that might have been pity. He slid a document across the table. A deed. My inheritance. Lot number 14. I recognized the property description immediately. It was Grandpa's radio tower. This rusted piece of infrastructure sitting on 6 acres of land that nobody wanted. The soil had been contaminated decades ago by some industrial operation, classified as brownfield. Couldn't build residential there. Without millions in remediation, couldn't farm it, could barely look at it without feeling depressed. The tower itself was a skeletal thing, 200 feet of oxidized metal climbing into empty sky. Grandpa had maintained an amateur radio license since the 1960s, used to broadcast weather reports and emergency communications back when that mattered, before cell phones made everything instant. I'd played there as a kid, exploring the concrete equipment shed at the base, pretending I was sending signals to Mars. My father smiled when Morrison mentioned the tower. Not a warm smile. The kind that makes you understand why reptiles never evolved facial expressions beyond hunger. He told me I used to love playing there. Said it with this tone that made childhood wonder sound like stupidity. Said now it was my inheritance, my legacy. Then he dropped the hammer. Property taxes. Except it wasn't just this year's taxes. Grandpa had let them slide for the past 3 years. Between that and the accumulated fines from the EPA for soil contamination that was never properly remediated, the total came to just over $6,000, due in full by April, or the county would seize the property. Hope you've been saving, he said. Kyle snorted. Actually snorted, like this was all hilarious. My mother still hadn't looked up from her phone. I should have left then. Should have just walked out, cut my losses, moved on with my life. But I was still trying to understand. Still trying to find the logic in how a father divides an estate by giving one son everything, and the other son nothing but a liability. That's when Arthur pulled out the printout. The sound of the laser printer is what I remember most clearly. That mechanical whir and click as it spit out page after page. Morrison's printer, sitting on a credenza behind his desk, expensive and efficient. Arthur had brought a USB drive. Professional, prepared. He laid the pages on the table between us. Spreadsheet, Excel, color-coded categories. My entire childhood itemized. Health insurance premiums from age 5 to 18. Dental work, including braces. That time I broke my arm falling out of a tree, emergency room visit and follow-up appointments. School supplies, clothes, food, estimated at market rate. The car insurance after I got my license. College tuition, even though I'd paid most of myself with loans. He'd co-signed those loans. He reminded me that counted as a parental investment. every birthday present, every Christmas gift, every dollar he'd ever spent on me, cataloged with the precision of an accountant preparing for an audit. The total at the bottom, in bold red text, $152,400. Even the cents. He'd calculated it down to the cents. Arthur explained his methodology. Conservative estimates, he assured me. Market rates for goods and services. He hadn't even included the psychological investment, the time and energy of raising a child. This was purely financial, purely objective. I stared at that number for a long moment before I spoke. Asked him if he'd really counted Christmas presents as debt, birthday gifts. That bike when I was 7. He didn't hesitate. Told me those were investments in my development that clearly hadn't paid off. Said every successful parent tracks their ROI, return on investment. That's what children were supposed to be. My mother finally looked up from her phone. She glanced at the spreadsheet, then at me, then back to her screen. No comment, no reaction, just mild curiosity, like she was checking the weather. Arthur continued. A developer had approached him about Lot 14, quarry operation expansion, or maybe a waste management facility. Something industrial that didn't care about contaminated soil. They were offering $40,000. Cash. Quick closing. He had the quitclaim deed ready. Right there on the table, next to the spreadsheet. All I had to do was sign. Transfer the property to him, and he'd apply that $40,000 to my debt. We'd call it even on that portion. I'd still owe him $112,000, but at least it would be progress. The alternative, he explained with the calm rationality of a man explaining math to a child, was legal action. He'd sue me for the full amount, wreck my credit score. I was barely scraping by as it was, working IT support for a regional hospital system. Couldn't afford a lawyer to fight him. Couldn't afford much of anything, really. One lawsuit and I'd be finished. No apartment, no car loan, nothing. He'd make sure of it. He gave me 5 minutes to decide. I looked at my mother. She was reading something on her phone, completely absorbed. I looked at Kyle. He was leaning back in his chair, eyes closed, listening to whatever music was playing through those AirPods. I looked at Morrison, the lawyer, hoping for something. Guidance. Objection. Anything. He avoided my eyes. I told Arthur no. Simple as that. Just no. I wouldn't sign. His face didn't change much. Just a slight tightening around the eyes, the way it used when I get a B instead of an A. Disappointment mixed with something colder. Control slipping. Kyle pulled out one AirPod long enough to ask if we were done yet. He had plans. I stood up, told Arthur I'd take my chances with the tower and the taxes. Morrison handed me the deed, along with a folder of paperwork, title documents, maintenance records, keys to the equipment shed. My father stood too. He told me I was making a mistake. Told me I'd always been stubborn, always thought I was smarter than everyone else, and that was exactly why I'd never amount to anything. Then he looked at Morrison and said we were finished here. My mother spoke without looking up from her screen, told me not to be selfish, said Kyle needed a real start in life, said I'd always been a burden, and this was my chance to finally contribute something meaningful to the family. Her voice was flat, emotionless, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized but didn't really believe. She never once made eye contact. I stood there for a second, trying to reconcile this woman with the one who used to bake me birthday cakes from scratch, who'd stayed up with me when I had nightmares as a kid, who'd taught me to ride a bike. That person was gone. Or maybe she'd never existed. Maybe I'd just imagined the warmth because I'd needed it to be real. I walked out of that office with a deed to worthless land and a clear understanding of exactly what I meant to the people who'd raised me. A line item in a spreadsheet, an expense to be managed and minimized. But I wasn't done processing the day's surprises. I'd left some stuff at my parents' house. Not much, just some boxes in the garage. I'd moved out right after college, been renting a tiny studio apartment across town for the past year. But my father had said I could store things there. Old textbooks, winter clothes, a laptop I'd been meaning to fix. He'd even helped me carry the boxes in. Said family helps family. Now I understood it was just another lever he could pull when he needed it. The house looked the same as always. Two-story colonial, professionally landscaped, three-car garage. The American suburban dream rendered in vinyl siding and property taxes. My father's Lexus was already in the driveway. He'd beaten me home, even though I'd left the lawyer's office first. Must have sped. I used my key. Well, tried to. The lock had been changed. I knocked, waited, knocked again. Arthur opened the door, but didn't invite me in. He stood in the doorway, blocking it with his body. Told me I didn't live there anymore. Told me I'd made my choice, and choices have consequences. I explained about my things in the garage. He said they were his things now. Everything in his house belonged to him. If I wanted to dispute that, I could hire a lawyer. Otherwise, I needed to leave his property. I tried to push past him, not aggressively, just trying to get to my boxes. That's when he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. The operator's voice was tinny through the speaker. My father explained that there was a trespasser refusing to leave his property. Gave the address. Said he felt threatened. I could hear the professionalism in his voice, the careful word choice. He'd thought this through. I left before the cops showed up. Didn't need that complication in my life. I sat in my car at the end of the block and watched the police cruiser pull up 15 minutes later. Watched my father talk to the officer, gesturing, explaining. Watched the cop nod, write something in a notebook, then get back in his car and drive away. That was it. 28 years of being someone's son, erased in an afternoon. I drove to a Motel 6 on the edge of town. $63 a night. The room smelled like cigarettes and industrial cleaner. The bed was hard. The TV only got basic cable. But it was mine, paid for with my own money, and nobody could take it away from me. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, holding the deed to Lot 14, a radio tower on poison ground. My inheritance, my burden, my grandfather's last gift. I didn't understand it yet. Didn't understand what he'd really left me. But I would, because unlike my father, my grandfather had always thought about the long game. He'd always understood that sometimes the most valuable things are the ones nobody else wants. The folder of documents sat on the nightstand. Title, maintenance records, keys, and buried in there somewhere, those licenses Arthur had dismissed as senile obsession. Paperwork for equipment that supposedly didn't work anymore. I threw the folder onto the passenger seat of my Honda Civic. The next morning, the check engine light was on. Had been for 3 months. I couldn't afford to fix it. Couldn't afford much of anything with $800 to my name and $6,000 in taxes due by April. I didn't have a home anymore. Didn't have a family. In 4 months, I'd probably be bankrupt, just like Arthur predicted. But I had one thing, a rusted spike of metal stabbing into sky on the outskirts of town. 6 acres of contaminated dirt that nobody wanted. My father saw scrap metal. Junk. A liability. But Grandpa had always said something that never made sense to me until now. He'd point at the tower and tell me Arthur was the kind of man who only looked at the ground, at the dirt, at what he could touch and sell. Then he'd tap my chest and say I needed to look at the waves, at what moved through the air that nobody else could see. I'd been a kid. I'd thought he was being poetic. Philosophical old man stuff. Now I had nothing left but that tower. And if there was anything worth understanding about what my grandfather had really left me, I was about to find out. That's where I was headed. The drive took 45 minutes. 45 minutes of watching the city thin out into strip malls, then into nothing. Just highway and scrubland and the occasional billboard advertising injury lawyers or fireworks superstores. The check engine light glowed steady on my dashboard like a countdown timer I couldn't afford to acknowledge. I'd passed this exit 1,000 times growing up, never paid attention to it. Just another off-ramp leading to nowhere anyone wanted to go. Industrial parks that went belly up in the 80s. Abandoned quarries filled with stagnant water. The kind of place where cities dump their problems and hope nobody notices. Lot 14 sat at the end of a gravel road that hadn't seen maintenance since before I was born. My Civic rattled over potholes deep enough to lose a tire in. Dust coated my windshield. I didn't bother with the wipers. Didn't matter. Nothing out here was worth seeing clearly. The tower announced itself before I saw the property line. 200 feet of rust-orange metal stabbing up from a flat landscape, like a giant middle finger to gravity. Skeletal. That's the word that kept coming to mind. Like someone had stripped away everything unnecessary and left only the bones. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, topped with barbed wire that had gone slack with age. The gate hung open. Probably had been open for years. No point locking up what nobody wanted to steal. I drove through and parked next to the equipment shed. Calling it a shed was generous. It was a concrete box, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, with a metal door that had oxidized into a shade of brown that nature never intended. One small window, so coated with grime I couldn't see through it. The whole structure looked like something you'd find in a prison yard or a bomb shelter from the Cold War era. This was it. My inheritance. My castle. I sat in the car for a long time with the engine off, just staring at this thing, trying to figure out what my grandfather had been thinking, trying to understand how this pile of metal and concrete was supposed to save me from $6,000 in debt and a father who'd itemized my childhood like a tax return. The key from Morrison's folder fit the padlock on the door. That was something. At least I could get inside. The interior smelled like motor oil and rust, and something else I couldn't quite place. Old electronics. Maybe. That particular scent of degraded plastic and oxidized copper. There was a cot against one wall. Military surplus by the look of it. One of those canvas things that fold up into nothing. A sleeping bag rolled up on top. Both looked ancient but intact. A small space heater sat in the corner. Propane. The tank was empty. There was a card table with 2 folding chairs. A cooler that had seen better decades. And along the back wall, a workbench covered in radio equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum. Vacuum tubes. Dial indicators with actual needles. Wiring so old the insulation had cracked and peeled away in places. Above the workbench, someone had mounted a wooden sign. Hand-carved, probably by my grandfather. It read, "Not everything that counts can be counted." I stood there reading that sign over and over, trying to extract meaning from it, like it was some kind of prophetic wisdom. It just made me feel more lost. The sun was setting by the time I'd finished taking inventory. I had the deed. I had keys. I had access to a concrete box with no heat and no running water. There was a porta-potty around the side of the building that I didn't want to think about too hard. I walked the perimeter as the sky turned orange and purple. The contaminated soil looked like normal dirt to me. Brown, dry, cracked from lack of rain. But apparently, it was poison enough that nobody could build here without spending millions they'd never recoup. The tower itself was secured with guy wires. These thick steel cables anchored into concrete blocks at cardinal points around the structure. They hummed in the wind. Not a pleasant hum. More like the sound of something under tension that might snap at any moment. I climbed the access ladder about 20 feet up before my fear of heights kicked in, and I came back down, high enough to see that the metal was worse up close than it looked from the ground. Rust ate through in places, leaving holes the size of quarters. The whole thing swayed slightly in the wind, like it was breathing. My grandfather had maintained this, had climbed this tower regularly for decades, had believed it was worth preserving. I couldn't see it, couldn't understand what I was supposed to do with it. Night came fast, the kind of dark you don't get in cities. No streetlights, no houses nearby with their porch lights on, just the stars and a sliver of moon and the red aviation warning light blinking at the top of the tower. On, off, like a heartbeat. I sat on the cot in the equipment shed with the door open, eating cold beans straight from the can. Campbell's, the same brand my mom used to heat up when I was sick. Funny how memories attach themselves to the weirdest things. Now, all I could taste was a metallic tang of the can and the knowledge that she hadn't even looked at me when she called me a burden. The temperature had dropped into mid-40s. I zipped myself into the sleeping bag fully clothed and lay there listening to the tower sing in the wind. I must have slept eventually because I woke up to the sound of an engine. Loud, powerful, the kind of engine that costs money to feed. Sunlight streamed through the dirty window. I left the door cracked open for air. Through it, I could see a Ford Bronco, brand new. Still had the temporary tags in the window. Bright blue. Probably $45,000, sitting there in my contaminated dirt parking lot. Kyle climbed out wearing designer sunglasses and a North Face jacket that cost more than my monthly rent. He had his phone out, already recording. I stayed inside the shed, watched through the crack in the door. My father got out of the passenger side. Different suit than yesterday. Same expression. That particular blend of disappointment and superiority he perfected over the years. Kyle was doing a slow pan of the property, narrating for his TikTok audience. I couldn't hear exactly what he was saying, but I caught phrases. Homeless brother. Living in a shack. Failed adult. He kept the camera on the shed, on the tower, on the beat-up Civic Park next to his shiny Bronco. My father just stood there with his arms crossed, letting it happen. Eventually, they got tired of filming an empty lot and came to the door. My father knocked. Not aggressive, just steady, patient, like he had all the time in the world. I opened it. Arthur looked me over, took in the wrinkled clothes, the unshaved face, the sleeping bag visible behind me. I watched something flicker in his eyes. Not quite satisfaction, more like confirmation of a hypothesis. He told me this didn't have to continue. Said he'd spoken with the developer again. They were willing to go up to $45,000 now. Market rates fluctuating. I could take the money, sign the quitclaim deed right there, and he'd personally drive me to the Greyhound station, buy me a ticket to anywhere I wanted to start over. Fresh start, he called it. A chance to stop embarrassing the family name. Kyle was still filming, capturing this moment. My father offered me salvation while I stood in the doorway of a concrete box, probably looking like exactly the kind of failure he'd always predicted I'd become. I asked him to leave, told him the property was mine, and they were trespassing. Arthur smiled. That reptile smile. Told me I'd come around eventually. Everyone does when they get hungry enough. Then he got back in the Bronco. Kyle gunned the engine loud enough to wake the dead, and they left a cloud of dust in their wake that took 10 minutes to settle. I stood there in that dust, breathing it in, tasting dirt and exhaust of my own anger. Then I remembered something my grandfather had said. Years ago, I'd been maybe 12, helping him clean the equipment shed. I'd asked him what all this junk was for, why he kept maintaining a radio tower. Nobody listened anymore. He'd looked at me with those sharp old eyes and tapped the side of the transmitter. Told me people always look at the iron, at the metal, at what they can touch. But iron's just a trap. What matters is what it catches, what moves through it that you can't see. I'd thought he was being philosophical, one of those old man wisdom things that sound profound but doesn't actually mean anything. Now I walked over to that transmitter, this big metal cabinet against the wall, probably from the 1970s, covered in dials and switches, and warning labels about high voltage. My father had mentioned it once, years ago, said he'd tried to move it during a cleaning session and got shocked, left it alone after that. Too dangerous. Too much liability. I looked at it closer now. Really looked. The warning labels were faded but still legible. Danger. High voltage. Do not open while energized. Except the equipment shed wasn't connected to power. Hadn't been for years. No power lines ran to this structure. Everything here was dead. I opened the access panel. No shock. No surge. Just old wiring and dust and the smell of decayed electronics. And behind the main circuit board, hidden in a cavity that you wouldn't see unless you knew to look for it, there was a latch. Simple. Mechanical. The kind of thing you'd use to secure a hidden compartment. I pulled it. A section of the transmitter's back panel swung open. Inside was a Pelican case. Heavy duty. Waterproof. Fireproof. The kind of thing you use to protect what matters most. It was locked, but the key was taped to the top. My grandfather's handwriting on the tape, from Mark. My hands shook as I unlocked it. Inside was a stack of documents in a clear plastic sleeve. On top, a laminated certificate. Federal Communications Commission, license for radio broadcasting on frequency 600 megahertz, issued to Harold Brennan, renewed annually for the past 40 years, current through 2026. Underneath, there was a handwritten note on yellow legal paper, my grandfather's handwriting, shaky but clear. Mark, it said, the land is worth nothing. Anyone who tells you different is lying or stupid, but the sky above it is worth everything. Hold on to the 600 megahertz frequency. I've kept it active for you. Paid the renewal fees from a separate account your father doesn't know about. The lawyers have instructions to transfer the license to you regardless of what happens to the property. The license isn't tied to the land deed. It's separate, an intangible asset the FCC granted to me personally. Your father thinks property means dirt and buildings. He doesn't understand that the most valuable property is what you can't touch. The frequency rights stay with the tower operator, not the landowner. That's why I made sure the license transfer goes directly to you. Don't sell it to corporations, no matter how much they offer. Wait for the word auction. Capital A, government auction. When you hear that word, you'll know it's time. Your father sees scrap metal. He's always been that way. Only understands what he can touch and count. You're different. You see the waves, the things that move through the world invisible. This tower is worthless, but what it carries is priceless. Trust yourself. Trust the frequency. Love, Grandpa. I read that note 3 times. 4 times. Trying to understand what it meant. Frequency. Auction. 600 megahertz. I'd heard those terms before, but never understood them. Radio spectrum. Broadcasting rights. It was all just background noise in a world of cell phones and Wi-Fi. But my grandfather had spent 40 years keeping this license active, had hidden it from my father, had left me not just a tower, but access to something invisible that apparently mattered enough to protect in a fireproof case. I needed information, real information, not guesses. The equipment shed had no internet. My phone had barely any signal out here. I needed to get to somewhere with computers, with resources. The public library was back in town, 25 minutes away. They had computers, free internet access. I'd used them during college when I couldn't afford my own connection. I locked the Pelican case back in the transmitter, closed everything up, and drove back to civilization. The library was nearly empty on a weekday afternoon. Just me and a few homeless people using the air conditioning, and a librarian who looked like she'd given up on life around the same time I graduated high school. I logged into one of the public terminals and typed in the first search term, FCC 600 megahertz license. The results were overwhelming. Pages and pages of technical documents, legal filings, industry news. I started reading. Started trying to piece together what my grandfather had known. The 600 megahertz band. Low-frequency radio spectrum. The kind that travels far, penetrates buildings, covers huge areas with minimal infrastructure. TV stations used to broadcast on it. Then the government decided that spectrum was more valuable for cellular networks. For 5G, for the future. They'd held auctions. Incentive auction 1000, then 1001. The numbers were staggering. Auction 1001 alone had brought in $19.8 billion. That wasn't a typo. Billion with AB. Telecommunications companies bidding against each other for slices of invisible air. Now they were preparing for auction 1002, the final major sweep for remaining low-frequency spectrum. I kept digging. Found references to incentive auction 1002, scheduled for later this year. Final major auction for remaining low-frequency spectrum. Found a map showing spectrum allocation across the country, color-coded by frequency, by ownership, by availability. And there, in the middle of a large gap between two states, was a single point marked as privately held. Legacy license, 600 megahertz. Active. I zoomed in on that map, checked the coordinates against the deed to lot 14. It was my tower, my frequency, and according to the technical analysis I was reading, it was what they called a golden spike, a critical connection point. Without that single frequency in that specific location, the major carriers couldn't create a continuous 5G network across 2 states, couldn't meet their coverage obligations, couldn't make their multi-billion-dollar infrastructure investments work. They needed my frequency, my tower, my grandfather's 40 years of careful maintenance and license renewals. I sat back in that library chair, staring at the screen. My father thought he'd given me garbage, contaminated land and rusted metal, and a tax bill I couldn't pay. But what he'd actually given me was leverage. The kind of leverage that made $45,000 look like pocket change. The kind of leverage that changed everything. I just had to figure out how to use it without Arthur finding out and making another play for control. Because once he understood what he'd overlooked, he wouldn't just offer me bus tickets anymore. I printed out everything I could. Technical specs, auction schedules, market analyses, used up my last $5 in printing fees, stuffed the pages into the folder Morrison had given me. The drive back felt different. The check engine light still glowed on my dashboard, steady and unforgiving. The Civic rattled over the same potholes, burned the same oil. Nothing about my physical situation had changed. I still had $800 to my name. Still had $6,000 in taxes due by April. Still lived in a concrete box with no heat and no running water. But now I knew what I was sitting on. Then I drove back to my concrete box in the middle of nowhere with a sleeping bag and a can of beans and knowledge that felt like carrying fire in my bare hands. The tower looked different now. Still rusted. Still swaying in the wind. But no longer worthless. My grandfather had been right. People look at iron and see metal, see weight, see what corrodes and fails. But what moved through that iron, invisible and constant, was worth more than anything my father had ever understood. I just had to hold on long enough to prove it. The tower looked different now. Still rusted, still swaying in the wind, but no longer worthless. I spent that first night going through every document in the Pelican case, memorizing numbers and dates like my life depended on it, because it did. The printouts from the library covered the card table in the equipment shed, FCC regulations, auction procedures, market analyses showing why 600 megahertz spectrum was worth killing for. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that map with a single point of privately held spectrum, the golden spike. My spike. By morning, I had a plan, or at least the beginning of one. Hold the line. Wait for the auction. Don't let Arthur find out what I had until it was too late for him to do anything about it. That plan lasted exactly 3 days. I was replacing a section of fence wire when I heard the engine. Not like Kyle's Bronco. This was something heavier, more expensive, the kind of vehicle that costs more than most people's houses. A black Lincoln Navigator rolled through my open gate like it owned the place. Tinted windows, chrome so polished I could see my reflection in it from 50 feet away. It parked next to my dying Civic, and the contrast was almost funny. Almost. 2 men got out. Suits. Not the kind you buy at Men's Warehouse. The kind that get tailored to your exact measurements. One was older. Silver hair, that particular confidence that comes from never hearing the word no. The other was younger, maybe 30, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly rent used to. The older one introduced himself, said his name was Richard something, corporate counsel for Vanguard Telecom. He'd noticed a change in the FCC licensing database. New operator for the 600 megahertz frequency at this location. Wanted to discuss a business opportunity. I didn't invite them inside the shed. Just stood there in my dirty jeans and work boots, letting them look at me like I was something they'd scraped off their shoes. Richard got straight to it. Said Vanguard was building out a 5G network across the region. They'd acquired most of the necessary spectrum. But there was a gap, a critical gap, right here, right where I was standing. He offered me $5 million. Just like that. $5 million. Cash. They could have papers drawn up by the end of the week. I could walk away clean, start over anywhere I wanted, never look back. I remember my grandfather's note. Wait for the word auction. Don't sell to corporations. I told Richard no. Told him I'd see him at the government auction. His expression didn't change. Just nodded slowly, like he'd expected this. The younger lawyer handed me a business card. Said the offer stood if I changed my mind. Then they got back in their Lincoln and drove away, leaving me standing in contaminated dirt with my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. $5 million. I just turned down $5 million. I should have known Arthur would find out, should have anticipated it. But I was so focused on holding on to what I had that I didn't think about how fast information travels in circles where millions are at stake. 2 days after Vanguard's visit, I got served. Process server showed up at 6 a.m, handed me papers through the door of my shed. Lawsuit: Arthur Brennan versus Mark Brennan. Petition of Harold Brennan, declared mentally incompetent at the time of estate planning. Request for a temporary restraining order to prevent any transfer or sale of assets pending resolution. My father was trying to invalidate Grandpa's decisions, trying to prove the old man hadn't been in his right mind when he set up the license transfer, and he was asking the court to freeze everything until he could prove it. The hearing was scheduled for 10 days out. I had 10 days to prove my grandfather knew exactly what he was doing. 10 days to protect the only thing I had left. I drove to the county records office. Burned gas I couldn't afford to burn, with that check engine light glowing steady. Started pulling documents, death certificates, medical records, anything that might show Grandpa's mental state in his final years. What I found was a gift. 6 months before he died, my grandfather had gone to his doctor specifically to get a cognitive assessment, mini mental state examination, MMSE, the gold standard for evaluating mental capacity. He'd scored 29 out of 30, normal for his age, sharp as ever, and he'd recorded a video the same day, had his doctor witness it, notarize it, the whole 9 yards. I found the flash drive in his medical records, sealed in an envelope with my name on it. I sat in the records office bathroom and watched that video on my phone. Battery down to 15%. Screen cracked, but I could see him clearly enough. Grandpa sat in his doctor's office, looking tired but focused. He stated his name, the date, the purpose of the recording. Then he looked straight at the camera and said he knew Arthur would try this, knew his son would claim incompetence, would try to steal what wasn't his. That's why he'd taken the test. That's why he was making this recording. He said the tower was mine. The license was mine. He'd kept it active and legal for 40 years specifically, so I'd have something Arthur couldn't touch. Something Arthur wouldn't even understand until it was too late. Then he smiled. Said Arthur had always been the kind of man who counted everything and understood nothing, and that I was different, that I saw the value in invisible things. The video was dated 3 days before he went into the coma. The courtroom smelled like floor polish and old wood, and the particular anxiety that permeates any place where people's lives get decided by strangers in robes. Arthur showed up looking like he was interviewing for CEO of Goldman Sachs. Brooks Brothers suit, silk tie, shoes polished to a mirror shine. His lawyer was some downtown firm partner, whose hourly rate probably matched my annual income. I showed up in the same jeans and hoodie I'd been wearing at the tower. Hadn't slept well. Hadn't eaten. My public defender looked fresh out of law school and terrified. The judge was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses and an expression that said she'd seen every possible variant of family fighting over money. Arthur's lawyer went first. Painted a picture of an elderly man, isolated, making irrational decisions. Pointed out that the tower was worthless scrap metal, that the license was for outdated technology nobody used anymore, that clearly Harold Brennan hadn't understood what he was doing when he directed the transfer to a grandson instead of his own son. They entered the Excel spreadsheet into evidence. My father's itemized list of everything he'd spent raising me. Argued that this showed a pattern of Mark being financially irresponsible, unable to manage assets, that the tower should be part of the general estate, managed by Arthur as executor. My public defender stammered through an objection that went nowhere. Then it was my turn. I handed the flash drive to the bailiff, asked the court to view the video. The judge allowed it. The courtroom went quiet as my grandfather's voice filled the space. Calm, clear, methodical, stating his name and the date and his score on the cognitive test, explaining exactly why he was doing this, looking directly into the camera and calling out his son by name. When it ended, Arthur's face had gone pale. Not embarrassed pale, angry pale. The kind of pale that comes from losing control of a situation you thought you owned. The judge asked if there were any other exhibits. Arthur's lawyer tried to argue that the video was inadmissible, that it was recorded without proper legal oversight. But the notary's seal was right there on the medical records. The doctor's signature. Everything done by the book. The judge denied the petition, denied the temporary restraining order, ruled that Harold Brennan had been of sound mind and body when he made his estate decisions, that the license was mine, free and clear, and that Arthur had no claim to it. Case closed. I walked out of that courtroom with my hands shaking. Arthur didn't look at me, just gathered his papers and left through a different exit, his lawyer talking rapidly into his phone. The auction was set for 3 weeks later. I got the notification from the FCC via email. Incentive auction 1002. Final bidding for remaining 600 megahertz spectrum. Online platform. Qualified bidders only. I qualified automatically as the current license holder. Had the right to accept or reject any final bids for my frequency. 3 weeks to prepare. 3 weeks to figure out how to do this without Arthur sabotaging it somehow. 3 weeks with a car that might die any day and $800 that was now down to $200 after legal fees and gas. I spent those weeks memorizing everything I could about auction procedure, how the bidding worked, what the interface looked like, how to accept an offer. I practiced on mock-up sites, running through scenarios until I could navigate the system blindfolded. The tower became my home in a way I hadn't expected. I learned its sounds. The way the metal sang different notes depending on wind direction, the pattern of rust that marked where water ran during rain, the exact angle the morning sun hit the equipment shed window. I thought about my grandfather a lot, about how he'd seen this coming, had prepared for it, had trusted me to hold the line. Auction day was a Tuesday, started at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. I needed internet access, reliable internet, not my phone's spotty signal. The nearest place with free Wi-Fi was a McDonald's about 4 miles from the tower. I got there at 8 a.m., bought the cheapest thing on the menu, small fries, $1.29. Sat in a corner booth with my phone charged to 100% and a borrowed tablet I'd gotten from the library's tech lending program. The auction platform loaded at 8:45. I logged in using my FCC credentials. Saw my lot number, lot 14. 600 megahertz frequency, specific coordinates, privately held legacy license. Starting bid, $10 million. At 9 a.m., the first bid came in. Vanguard Telecom, $10 million. At 9:02, another carrier jumped in, $12 million. By 9:15, we were at $20 million. I sat there with greasy fries on my fingers, watching numbers climb on a screen. The interface made a little ding sound every time a new bid posted. Ding, 25 million. Ding, 30 million. Ding, 35 million. The McDonald's staff kept looking at me. Some guy in worn-out clothes, hunched over a tablet, sweating despite the air conditioning. Probably thought I was watching something I shouldn't be watching. I kept one eye on the Wi-Fi signal indicator. 4 bars. Strong. But I'd tested it 3 times that morning, walked around the restaurant checking for dead spots. This corner booth had the best signal, most stable. I was praying it wouldn't drop at the worst possible moment. By 10 a.m., we hit 50 million. The bidding slowed down, bigger jumps between offers. Some carriers were dropping out, but the main players stayed in. Vanguard, T-Mobile, Verizon, they all needed this frequency. Needed it badly enough to keep pushing. 75 million at 10:30. 100 million at 11 o'clock. I hadn't moved from that booth. Hadn't eaten the fries. My heart was doing things hearts probably shouldn't do. The numbers on the screen were abstract. They didn't feel real. Couldn't be real. At 11:45, something changed. The bids started jumping in bigger increments, 20 million at a time. These companies had done the math, knew what it would cost them if they didn't get this frequency, knew what they'd lose in infrastructure, in coverage obligations, in market share. 150 million, 170 million, 190 million. At 12:14 p.m., the bid hit $200 million. The ding sound felt different now, heavier, like each notification carried actual weight. My phone buzzed, text from an unknown number. I knew it was Arthur before I even opened it. He'd somehow got my number. The message was simple: we need to talk. Family split, 50/50ths. Call me. I deleted it. The bidding continued. 220 million, 230 million, 240 million. At 12:47 p.m., the final bid came in. $242 million, $300,000. The timer started. 3 minutes for counterbids. If nobody bid higher, the auction closed. I watched that timer count down. Watched the seconds tick away. 3 minutes. 2 minutes. 1 minute. At 30 seconds, I looked up from the screen and saw through the McDonald's window. Saw a silver Lexus RX screaming into the parking lot. Saw my father jump out before the car had fully stopped. Saw him running toward the entrance. The timer hit 0. The screen flashed. Auction closed. Accept final bid? I pressed accept. The door opened. Arthur burst in, scanning the restaurant. Our eyes met across the space. I saw him see the tablet, see my expression, see everything click into place. He stopped in the middle of the McDonald's, breathing hard, and just stared at me. I logged out of the platform, shut down the tablet, gathered my things. He didn't try to stop me, just stood there as I walked past him, out into the parking lot, into my dying Civic with its glowing check engine light. 3 days after the auction, I got an official notification from the FCC. Thick envelope, government letterhead. Letter about opening an escrow account. The full transfer would take 60 to 90 days. Background checks. Antitrust analysis. Legal review of the license transfer. Standard government procedure when this much money changes hands. But that escrow account was real. Verified. Guaranteed. $238,700,000 minus fees and processing. Sitting in a government-backed holding pattern with my name on it. My bank saw it. Within 6 hours of that letter arriving, I got a call from someone in their private banking division, a department I didn't even know existed. They wanted to discuss my financial needs, wanted to open accounts, wanted to offer services. They set me up with a credit line, several $100,000, available immediately, backed by the guaranteed auction payment. For the first time in months, I could actually afford to hire help, to write checks, to breathe without calculating every dollar. I woke up that morning in my concrete shed and checked the new bank account they'd opened for me. Premium checking. No fees. A debit card that actually worked. Saw the credit line sitting there, active and ready. I sat there on that military surplus cot for a long time, just trying to process what having actual financial backing meant after months of counting pennies for gas money. The press found out that afternoon. By evening, there were news vans at my gate, reporters shouting questions, helicopters overhead, the whole circus. The next morning, my family showed up. I heard them before I saw them. Arthur's voice carrying over the fence, talking to reporters, spinning some story about family values and shared success. Then I saw them through the chain link, all 3 of them. Arthur in a different expensive suit. My mother in clothes that probably cost more than my car. Kyle holding a Whole Foods bag like it was some kind of peace offering. Cameras everywhere. They'd timed this for maximum exposure. I walked to the fence but didn't open the gate. That was important. The physical barrier. My mother started crying immediately. The kind of crying that's performative, meant for cameras. She told the reporters we were a close family, that they'd always supported me. That this was such a proud moment for all of them. She told me through the fence that they'd only wanted me to be strong, that everything they'd done was a teaching strategy. Tough love. Couldn't I see that now? Kyle jumped in, all smiles for cameras. Called me bro, said we were blood. Asked if I'd seen the new Pagani that just came out. Hinted that family should help family get the finer things in life. Arthur was more direct. Tried to hand me papers through the fence. Said he'd drawn up a family trust structure. We could put the money in there, manage it together, protect it from taxes, make it grow. He'd take care of all the details. Just needed my signature. I pulled out my checkbook. Not the old one I'd been using for years. The new one, premium checking from private banking. The one backed by hundreds of thousands in available credit. Wrote a check. Took my time with it. Made sure the cameras could see. $152,401. I tore it out and handed it through the fence to Arthur. Told him that covered his Excel spreadsheet. Every line item. Every calculated expense of raising me. Plus $1 extra for the quality of his parenting. I told him we were square. That he didn't need to call anymore. That we had no further business together. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion. Realization. Rage. He tried to refuse the check. I told him if he didn't take it, I'd donate the exact amount to charity in his name. He took it. My mother stopped crying. The performance fell away. She asked what they were supposed to tell people. How this looked. I suggested they tell people the truth, but I doubted they would. Kyle's smile disappeared. Asked if I was serious. If I was really not going to help them. I told him I was dead serious. Arthur crumpled the check in his fist. Told me I'd regret this. That family doesn't just disappear. That I'd come crawling back eventually. I called security. Professional guys I'd hired the day before. They escorted my family off the property. The cameras caught all of it. The stories came out over the next week. About Arthur's bankruptcy filing. Turned out he'd leveraged everything against the expectation of getting money from me. From the tower. From the inheritance he thought he'd controlled. When that fell through, the whole house of cards collapsed. Chapter 7. Full liquidation. The Lexus went. The house went. Everything went. I didn't feel good about it. Didn't feel bad either. Just felt like the scales had finally balanced. I didn't blow the money on mansions or cars or any of that. Use a chunk of it to establish the Grandpa's Radio and Tech Hub. Real deal. Business structure. Tax deductions. Educational programs for kids interested in engineering and communications. Named after a man who understood that the most valuable things are the ones you can't touch. The rest went into investments. Boring investments. The kind that grows slowly and steadily and don't make headlines. I kept the tower. Kept the shed. Fixed them up. Hired engineers to stabilize the structure. Restore the equipment. Turn it into something that actually worked again. 6 months after the auction, I climbed to the top of that tower. Professional safety equipment this time. Harness. Helmet. The works. The view from 200 feet up is different than you'd expect. You can see the curvature of the earth. See weather systems moving across the landscape. See the lights of cities that seem so important from the ground, but from up here are just small bright spots in the dark. The tower didn't look rusted anymore. The new coating caught the sunset, turned the metal golden. The whole structure hummed with frequency, with signals moving through it. Invisible but real. Valuable because someone understood what it meant. I stood up there as the sun went down, breathing air that felt different than any air I'd ever breathed. Cleaner. Thinner. Mine. My grandfather had been right about everything. About Arthur. About the tower. About understanding that worth isn't always something you can see or touch or count on a spreadsheet. The wind picked up. The tower swayed slightly, like it was breathing, like it was alive. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying anyone else's expectations. Wasn't measuring myself against someone else's Excel spreadsheet. Wasn't trying to prove I deserved to exist. I was just standing on a tower my grandfather had built, looking at a sky that belonged to me, breathing air that tasted like freedom. That was enough.